In this video, we're going to take a look at the different types of commands that we have at our disposal and how to use them in a general sense. Keep in mind there are many commands at your disposal, and going through each one individually is going to take a significant amount of time. Instead, I'm going to concentrate on the most common ones that you're probably going to be running into. So in general, whenever you're working with anything with the command, you always want to go ahead and double check the command Lua documentation page. This can be accessed online, and there's also an offline version of this as well. Basically, what this tool is going to give us is a breakdown of everything we're going to need to know and generally how to use it. Any sort of important information related to it will always come up on the top here, as well as give us the ability to understand the different properties. One thing that's worth noting is this documentation is very strong in that all the different items are going to be self-referencing. If I click on a particular item, it'll actually hyperlink myself to it. For example, maybe I'm not sure what that meant by contact. If I click on contact, it'll actually break it down by individual properties that we have. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of these basic options and sort of see what they can do. Like I said, I don't want to go into every one of them because there are a number of different commands that we have at our disposal, but it is worth noting the kind of basic ones that we're going to be looking at. So what we want to do is develop a quick function to give us all the properties we want of a particular unit that we've selected. So there's a bunch of different options we can do to approach that, but I'm going to stick to the absolute basic version here. So what I'm going to do is get myself the selected item. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. So the simplest way we can do is we can type it in, or we can go directly in here and try to identify which one of the commands we want. In this case, I'm going through. I don't necessarily see anything. If we go to the bottom, is there anything okay? Let's get scenario. This doesn't look good. So let me go over to the scenario, our little documentation very quickly, and then see if there's anything for get selected. There's nothing for that. Let's try the word. Selected units. That sounds good. So now what I'll do is go ahead and copy this. Now I'm taking a look here, and what do we know right away? First of all, it's going to return a table of values, and it's going to be split between units and context. So in this case, we're going to stick to a units side of it. So I'll go over here. I'll go ahead and type in the command itself, in which case I just copy pasted to make it easier. So now remember, this takes a table of values, returns a table of values, which means everything that's going to come out of it is going to be in its own organized little pile. So I'm simply going to say selected units, and we'll go ahead and save this as a local variable, and we'll call this units. So now just to demonstrate what this is going to look like, I'm going to type in units and go ahead and press the run key and see what happens. In this case, we have 2 units selected here, and I'm just going to be interested in the first unit I select. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make this so that it just gives us the units and not the contacts. So I'll type in the word .units, press run, and now we're only going to get the table that contains the 2 units in this case that we have selected. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get individual properties of those units. I'm going to use a simple iteration table here. We'll come in here and we'll say print v, which represents the current value inside of our array, dot GUID. And we'll go ahead and print out, have it also display our v.name as well. Go ahead and put a space. And again, we're just using the concatenation character here. So now if I run this function, it should give us a list of both of the vehicles separated by whatever we have here. Now, if this case I were to grab everything at one time and run this function again, you can see my list just gets a little bit bigger. I'm actually going to delete this print units because it gets a little complicated. Nice. What we'll also do is we'll go ahead and give ourselves a new line too, just to make it a little bit clearer that what we're working with here. There we go. Now it's super clear what we're working with, so which works very well. Now, the interesting thing is we're basically getting references to these units. We're not getting the actual properties of these units. What we really wanted to do is to dig down a little bit deeper. So we're going to have to get ourselves another function that's going to be able to provide us everything that we need along those lines. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Lua documentation and see if there's anything that makes sense. Let's see if there's a function for selected get unit. Here we are, get unit. Notice there's 2 different kinds of get unit. There's VP get unit, and then there's senedit get unit. So let's go ahead and see if we can find out what the differences between these 2 are. So senedit get unit, now let's see here, requires something called a unit selector. We're not sure what that is. We'll have to take a look at that. And it returns the value if it exists or anything along those lines. Fortunately for us, there's a bunch of little details down here that give us the ability. Like, for example, I notice that we're going to have to send in a table with some sort of GUID, which is a unique number for each unit. We're just going to have to make sure that we provide that appropriate context. All right, let's go take a look at that other one, the VP get unit, and see if we can identify the differences between the 2. Gets unit details of the active contact or unit. So this particular function actually goes ahead and gets us everything we needed based on what we've already selected. So in a way, this simplifies everything we're doing, but we're going to go ahead and do it kind of the long way, just because it's important that we understand exactly how that works. So we'll go down to get unit. Take a look at the items that we have in it. And like I said, we're going to be using the unit selector, which, as I recall, I believe is a table. It is a table. All right, let's go ahead and give this a try and see what happens. I'm actually going to borrow their example code real quick and go ahead and park it down here. clean this all up from before. I'm going to go ahead and post this down. But again, we're not going to be interested in name here. We're going to be interested in the GUID, since it's simply just going to be easier for us. So GUID equals v.GUID. Remember, this v is a reference to the item that's in this list that we have selected. So anything we get off of this will allow us to use this function. Now, aside, of course, is not the word blue. It's the BLU here. So let's go ahead and now run this and see if anything happens. Nothing happened. Actually, something did happen. We just never actually took the values and displayed them on the screen. So we'll go ahead and create a local variable. We'll call that unit stats. Set that equal to that. Now I'll go ahead and come down here and say print unit stats. Now we'll go ahead and press run. Ah, interesting. Take a look here. You can see that it took each and every one of these units and it broke it down into individual pieces that we can now identify. We can see what group it's a member of. We can see the type that it is. We have the name. We have all the different pieces of proficiency. We have the latitude. We have its current position, what its current orders are. Is it auto-detectable? We have information about its magazines, information about what state it's in. We have information about its fuel as well as its weapon. So we're able to get a tremendously larger amount of information here. Now, let's say, for example, we wanted to get the speed of that particular unit. Now, the nice thing is this is a large table, so we still have the ability to grab things out of that table. So since this is a table, we'll use our good table skills. I'll come down here and say speed. So what this will do is get me the value of speed for each item in that particular table. So now if I run that, I can see that all these particular units happen to actually be at the exact same speed. So the reason this is so useful is we could go use this and say if a certain unit is beyond a certain speed, we could delete it, for example, if we wanted to in a scenario, or we could cause it to change its speed depending on exactly what we're trying to do in a given scenario. So again, the get unit function is extremely powerful as far as digging down into all the different properties a given unit has. So the next type of function we're going to see that you're going to commonly run into is the add unit function. The add unit function is very, very powerful because it gives you the ability to create a unit on the fly. So now going back to our documentation, we'll go ahead and say add unit. And we can see there's a function called add unit. We'll go ahead and open this one up, and we can see immediately it is a tremendously long collection of information. Keep in mind, not every single one of these properties is required to be created. So I'm going to go ahead and make a quick copy of that data and go ahead and pop it down in here so we can start experimenting with it directly. Stretch that out just a tiny bit, and let's go through each one of the items. So whenever you're using add unit, you always want to take a look at the type. In our case, we'll go ahead and go with an aircraft. I think that's fair. A name, I'll go ahead and call this airplane. Loadout ID. This is where it starts to get a little complicated. The loadout ID refers to the loadout ID for the given airplane that we're creating. In this case, I'm going to go up to the database viewer. We'll go ahead and make this a nice and simple one. We'll add ourselves an E2D. Let's see here. Air refueling sounds good. And we see that 4293 is the DB ID. We also can take a look down here and take a look at my loadout IDs. In this case, our loadout ID is pretty straightforward. It is 14629. So I'm simply going to come over here. I'll minimize that. 14629. Keep in mind, you cannot attach a loadout to something that cannot actually have that loadout. We're going to say that our heading is due east. Our database ID is simply going to be the number that comes out of the database. In this case, we're going to be interested in 4293. We're going to establish our side. This side has to exist. We'll call it blue. And now we can define its latitude as well as its longitude. In this case, let's go ahead and put it right there, which is going to be 3250. 3250. And we'll say that its longitude is roughly let's say minus 119, east 119, or west 119, rather. We'll give it an altitude of 20,000 feet. We'll say it's not auto-detectable. We'll tell it, we're actually going to skip the whole fire piece here. We don't really need it. And we'll set its proficiency to be 2. So now when we run this code, assuming we made no errors as far as this goes, it should create this aircraft on us right away. Now that I've run it, you can see that we have a brand new airplane sitting right here. I'll zoom in a little bit. You'll notice that the name of that airplane is airplane. You'll notice it's facing due east. You'll notice its speed is 200 knots, and it has an altitude of 20,000 feet. Now, keep in mind that that's not the only thing we can create this unit to do. We actually have a wide variety of different options at our disposal that we can add to this particular aircraft. The key element, though, and this is something you're going to run into a few times, is making sure all the numbers are consistently accurate. Now, let's say, for example, we wanted to get a little creative here, and we actually wanted to create a group of airplanes kind of in a random sort of environment. Now we're going to get a little more sophisticated, but we're actually going to be able to see what this can look like in action. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and calculate where our particular units are going to be. For this, I'm going to go ahead and create some random variables. So I'm going to say local random lat equals, we'll say math.random. And we'll say values between, let's keep this up relatively straightforward, or we're dealing with a latitude of about 32. We'll say between 31 and 33. And then we'll say local random long between values of minus 118 and a value of, actually we want to do 120 minus 118. Go ahead and close that out real quickly. And we're just going to double check to make sure this works the way we think it does before we actually test it out in the field, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and delete our code here. Actually, temporarily, I'm going to hashtag this out. And let's go ahead and give it a spin to see what happens. Okay, so it's successfully generating these two numbers randomly. So I'm going to go back to my code here. I'm bringing it back over. And now I'm just simply going to change my latitude. Delete all this. I'm going to go ahead and type in random lat. And I'm simply going to change the one that says longitude instead of west 119. I'll go ahead and say random long. So now that we've done that, if I run this code, theoretically, it should generate an airplane randomly at a different position. Let's go ahead and delete the old one. Press the run command, and you can see we're now having randomly placed airplanes all around this particular region here. Now, one of the things that you can use to make this even more powerful is we can actually put this into a loop so that it actually runs it multiple times. For example, we can say for x equals 0, 10, and we'll say it iterates by 1, do, and we'll simply come to the end here. Type in the word end. Now it'll actually run this entire set of code a total of 10 times, which will get us 10 of these aircraft placed. Unfortunately, each one of these aircraft are going to have the exact same name. And you're also going to notice each one of these aircraft, unfortunately, often occupy the same space. The reason is because our math.random does not return floating point values. So if we want to get a little more precise here, we'd have to actually do some math to it. So in this case, I'm actually going to say add a 0 to each one of these. And I'm simply going to divide the value by 10 when it's done in order to create a little bit more entropy here. I'll press run, and you can see I've created significantly more chaos because now my random values are actually going to be a little bit wider. And you can see immediately just how powerful this actually is going to be. Now, the next thing we're going to take a look at, and this is something that's going to come up a lot, and that's going to be using the getSides command. The getSides command is going to give you the ability to get everything that's going on inside of a side. There's a couple different ways we can do this. The simplest way is to go down to the bottom, and we have the ability to go ahead and getSide. Notice there's a getSide and there's a getSides. In this case, we're just going to use getSide. Now, all we have to do is tell it what side we're working with. So what we're going to do is take this, of course, put it into a value. Let's say side A. We'll go ahead and say VP getSide, and now we just need to tell it what side we're going to be working with. The side will go ahead and stick to blue in this particular case. And we'll go ahead and print the value that we see here. Interesting. So we have a list of different items that come out of here. We have a GUID, which represents the GUID of the side. We have the name of the side. We have all the units as a table, and we have all the contacts as a table. So if we wanted to drill down a little bit deeper here, we can now say contacts equals side A dot contacts. And we could say units equals side A dot units. Now, if I wanted to, I could print contacts. And I could print my units separately. I'll put a little space there just for brevity here. And of course, we're going to have an issue because we did not spend this correctly. In this case, it says attempt to concatenate a table with a variable. That is not something that we can do. So in this case, we'd have to actually cut this one out and just stick to exactly the way it is like this. And now we can get a large table of all of the different items that we have on this particular side. Again, the getSides is tremendously, tremendously powerful. I should say getSide, because it's going to give us the capability to see everything that is inside of that side at this exact moment. It's not unusual to use this function to go ahead and constantly go back over and over and over again to look at everything inside of a side repeatedly. For example, we can measure for battle damage, or we can even randomly create battle damage on a particular scenario, depending on what we need to do with that. And again, this is a tremendously powerful tool for this purpose, and we can use getContacts for the purpose of actually identifying different types of contacts so we can determine exactly what happened. Now, built in here, you actually have a couple other tools as well. And for example, ones that will give you the ability to identify how far away something is or a specific bearing. Now, those tools are wonderfully useful, and you'll probably use them quite a bit. So now the nice thing about the bearing tool is we can actually go ahead and select it so that it measures the bearing between two items or 2 points in the world. For example, if I wanted to use one of these aircraft or one of these ships here, I could then go ahead and insert this command, put those two in there, and it'll actually tell me what the bearing is. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to type in bearing. Go ahead and make this a local variable. Local bearing equals. Now we simply have to say exactly who we are coming to and who we are coming from. Now this tool is particularly unique because it will actually go ahead and measure things without having to be in a table, but we can actually use a table of values such as a latitude and longitude, or even provide a specific GUID for particular items. So in this case, let's go ahead and now grab one of these GUIDs that we have on our list up here. Let's go ahead and grab one of the other GUIDs as well. Make sure your GeoID is a string, so we want to make sure we include it inside of quotes or parentheses here. And we're going to go ahead and measure that distance from that particular item over to, let's keep this nice and simple. Let's see, a Black Lancer. We'll try to find, we have a Nellis Air Force Base. That looks pretty good over there. A large aircraft hangar. Let's go ahead and grab this one right here. That looks pretty good. And now what it'll do is it'll go ahead and calculate that bearing for us. Note that nothing happens because we didn't actually output the information in it. So go ahead and type in bearing, press run, and you can see that gives us the exact bearing. Now, if we wanted to expand this a little bit, we could even go so far as to measure distance as well. So we can come in here under the tool, we can even go ahead and get ourselves a range. So this one works exactly the same way. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this one in here. I'll grab all those values we had just a few moments ago, stick it directly into here to make our lives a little bit simpler. And we'll say, make it a little bit nice and clear. Go ahead and call this one range. And let's take a look what this looks like. Excellent. So now we have our bearing and we also have our range all neatly laid out for us so that we can quickly and accurately evaluate things for the purposes of functions. Now, if we wanted to make some kind of loop that says if I go to a certain range, automatically go ahead and bypass something or change something depending on what that actually happens, this is again an excellent way to go ahead and use these functions. So this is basically just a preview of the different types of functions that you have in here. They're tremendously powerful. One of the best ways to learn these, of course, is to go through existing scenarios and take a look at it. There are also a couple online repositories that have a wide variety of these functions pretty much ready to go. If you're finding that you're using the same function over and over again, it's highly recommended that you save that as a separate Lua file, as we saw in the beginning, so that you can go ahead and open that one back up.